Yet a piece from Voz Populi, an exclusive N, is closely aligned with Spanish events. Very important. Be careful. The White House, according to Voz Populi, is currently working on a report against Spain with references to Ceuta and Melilla that are favorable to Morocco. Voz Populi says that the White House is already working on a report against vulnerable areas. On the geopolitical front, the vulnerable areas are Ceuta and Melilla, and the opening of a debate on whether Ceuta or Melilla should have their sovereignty, the two autonomous cities, Kula, the two autonomous cities, with Morocco and not Spain, as a result of what is happening in the relationship between the United States and Spain, with Sanchez and Trump. The other fundamental element I will now go into a little more detail, which Voz Populi exclusively cites in this information, points to 4 companies as vulnerable flanks. According to a report that Trump had read in Mar-a-Lago, according to Voz Populi, the report says that the vulnerable flanks are Ceuta and Melilla. Geopolitics leaves out the Canary Islands, but cites 4 companies. Repsol, pardon my words. Repsol, on the one hand, cites him regarding the problems that could arise in the oil fields to be exploited in Texas and Alaska in the generation and production of unconventional gas. In New Mexico, the impact on Repsol would be 10 billion euros for the next 3 years, and Venezuela. Despite the apparent excellent harmony between the company and the Department of Commerce, everything seems to indicate that it would be in a complicated situation. Also, what can be seen around Repsol's investments in Venezuela as a flank that it sees as dangerous or vulnerable in that report on Spain. The other 3 affected companies would be Indra, Telefonica, and Navantia. The U.S. administration, according to Populi, plans to take pressure measures that could affect Spanish publicly owned firms, in addition to Repsol, which is not publicly owned, and which operate in the United States, Indra, Telefonica, and Navantia, after Washington requested detailed information on the state's percentage of shareholding in these companies. The White House had already threatened to divest, after warning U.S. companies with interests in Spanish territory that Spain is not a reliable partner and that Sanchez is a traitor, as Trump said. Now, watch out. Because the effect of what B. Populi is announcing with that report that Trump would have already read in Mar-a-Lago raises 2 fundamental issues. The geopolitical aspect, where Trump's challenge, Sanchez's, to the Trump administration, would result in the U.S. government including or putting on the table Morocco's historic claim to Ceuta and Melilla. The dossier, which has been drafted by an advisor attached to the White House, according to Voz Populi, has already been presented to Trump, as he was told in Mar-a-Lago, in Palm Beach, Florida. The report, described as preventative, began to be drafted after the institutional statement of March 4-4, in which Sanchez made official the government's refusal to provide the Moron Rota, right? So that they can use the shared bases. In parallel, the United States and Washington have continued to strengthen bilateral relations, especially in defense matters, with the formation of several cooperation agreements that have made Morocco Washington's preferred partner on the African continent, with a commitment that also comes at a time of uncertainty about the continuity of the shared military bases on Spanish soil. Trump had already stated that he is studying the withdrawal of the bases from one of the NATO bases to punish some members of the alliance in which it was mentioned. Well, it could be Spain, Germany, the United Kingdom, outside Europe. And the idea would be to relocate to other territories, or NATO countries, or more collaborative countries. Now there is speculation about the option of Morocco, and there is talk that the possible proposal of sanctions against Spain coincides with a new escalation, also verbal, by the American president. So we have the last words of April 17 on True Social, when Trump said, "Has anyone looked at how badly the country of Spain is doing? Its economic figures, despite contributing almost nothing to NATO and its military defense, are horrendous. It is very sad to see it." And as I say, intron, the fundamental geopolitical point is around Ceuta and Melilla, according to Voz Populi in that report. The purely business point is with Repsol, Indra, Telefonica, and Navantia, the 4 companies that right now would be at the point of scarcely had the Strait of Hormuz reopened when it was once more closed, and immediately, the first freighter became the target of gunfire. Mr. Neumann, what are you currently observing? Yes, we're observing a period of intense back and forth as the deadline approaches. This signifies that multiple actors, most notably Donald Trump, are working to strengthen their position. That's certainly nerve-wracking, wouldn't you agree? It strongly suggests a repetition of the scenario we witnessed 2 weeks ago, one characterized by the simultaneous utterance of outrageous threats and the cautious exploration of negotiation avenues. This dual approach leaves one wondering what the ultimate strategy truly is. So this could turn out very well, or it could also turn out very badly. Donald Trump is not only demanding that the Iranians end their nuclear program, he is demanding that they abandon their ballistic missile system, that they stop supporting militias, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Hut, terrorist organizations in the region that they have sponsored for years, that they stop doing so. He is essentially demanding a capitulation of Iranian foreign policy. Iran is unlikely to accept this easily, mainly because Iran believes, whether correctly or incorrectly, that it is currently in a relatively strong position. So how this is to be reconciled is still completely unclear. But would you say that Trump is already at a point where there's no way out? He's skillfully navigated himself into a strategically tricky situation. The only solutions, however, involve caving in to Iranian demands, potentially meaning sanction easing sanctions, or he buys them into an end to their nuclear program, or he issues a kind of non-aggression declaration, but in the end he would then look like the loser. The best situation for him would probably be a situation where it ends, like the Obama agreement 10 or 11 years ago. This outcome would undoubtedly be catastrophic for him. It would clearly demonstrate that the war yielded little positive result. In essence, it would be shown that the gains made could have been, and perhaps even more effectively, achieved through peaceful negotiations, saving considerable resources and lives. All options available are unfavorable to him, suggesting a possible necessity for him to persist with the conflict, a path he would rather avoid. This implies considerable difficulties lie ahead for him. According to a poll conducted by RTL and NTV, Germans currently see the Mueller regime as having the advantage. Only 16% currently see Trump as having the upper hand. How do you assess that?
Well, I believe that both parties, both sides of the conflict, want to end this war. Even the Iranians, or the Iranian regime, then aren't interested in this going on like this forever anymore. One needs to also recognize the effect of the blockade implemented by the Americans, a blockade intended as a countermeasure, and acknowledge that it is already demonstrating effectiveness. Consequently, a palpable sense of time pressure is developing within Iran itself. So far, until now, the clock has always been ticking only on the American side. American policymakers desperately sought a deal because elections loom and the global economy is spiraling towards a recession due to the interruption of oil supplies. The pressure is also mounting for the Iranians, as they realize that if they are unable to export their oil, they are likely facing an end to their current situation within the next 2, 3, or 4 weeks. The question now is, which side is ticking faster? Where is it more urgent to reach a deal in a short period of time? And that is what we are currently observing. Therefore, both parties face significant challenges, but the blame for our current predicament rests squarely on the shoulders of Donald Trump and the American government. They are responsible for creating this predicament. In this respect, he has maneuvered himself into a difficult situation. Do
you currently see a winner or a loser? Ultimately, the most rational agreement would likely involve the Iranians stating that they are suspending their nuclear program, possibly for a duration of 10, 15, or even 20 years. They would promise this. In exchange for this commitment, there would be a corresponding easing of sanctions, and the substantial amount of Iranian assets currently frozen in financial institutions worldwide would be made accessible to their rightful owners again. That would be a solution E, but it would then look very similar to the Obama deal from 2015. And that is exactly what Donald Trump does not want. Given our contractual obligations, the situation is fraught with tension. It's certainly possible, if not likely, that the situation will escalate further before any agreement is reached. At the moment, it is very, very difficult to predict. In view of the rising oil prices, is there a risk of an energy crisis, especially with regard to China? Yes, I think that if this situation continues for several more weeks, it will inevitably escalate into a full-blown energy crisis. This energy crisis, in turn, will almost certainly lead to an inflation crisis, and it is conceivable that this could eventually evolve into a global economic crisis. Consequently, it's in the best interests of all involved that this conflict come to a swift and definitive conclusion. We must not forget that 20% of the world's oil production flows through the Straits of Hormuz. It is currently blocked. It was only open for a very short time. This means that 20% of the global oil supply is missing from the markets. That certainly has consequences for the price. And in relation to China, particularly it's true that Iran is the biggest oil supplier for China, and many products are ultimately manufactured in China, which eventually find their way into our markets. Therefore, stating that this is a problem for China is simply not sufficient, as the problems occurring within China will invariably lead to problems for us as well. Can you perhaps be a little more specific? What does that mean for us? Yes, this means that for us, sooner or later, the price increases or shortages that arise in Asia will inevitably be reflected in Europe. This is primarily due to the substantial volume of products we import from Asia, but also stems from the considerable presence of our companies operating and generating revenue within the Asian market. Therefore, within a globalized world economy, a situation that affects Asia, thus the world's largest markets, naturally isn't something from which Europe can easily insulate itself. This interconnectedness makes isolation impossible. This means that prices would rise here too. We would also have problems with supply chains. There would then also be, for us, the threat or the problem or the potential for a global economic crisis unfolding before our eyes. Mr. Neumann, we understand that Federal Defense Minister Pistorius is, let's say, tentatively discussing plans to involve the Bundeswehr in the task of securing the vital Strait of Hormuz. Are we slowly being drawn into the war? Well, Pistorius has stated quite clearly, and I believe this reflects the position of the federal government as well, that any participation in securing the Strait of Hormuz would only be possible if a peace agreement were to be reached. Thus, it refers to a scenario where the Strait of Hormuz would no longer be subject to either blocking or armed conflict. That would be an important mission, because it is important for the international community to show its presence there, and also to show that it wants to secure this important trade route for more people. But it would no longer be such a dangerous mission. And one shouldn't overlook the fact that, of course, the freedom of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz is also of immense importance to us. Yes, a significant volume of oil and liquefied gas flows through there, fueling energy demands across Europe. Therefore, I think it is also appropriate for Germany to possibly contribute to this effort, working alongside other nations and, naturally, with the authorization of a proper international mandate. Yes, they claim that peace is the first essential condition there. But how truly realistic is the notion that the region will ever settle down? I believe that, without a doubt, this war has thrown everything into disarray, and I suspect it will be many years before the situation there stabilizes sufficiently to return to normal. Look at the Gulf states, the Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, for example. Their entire business model has been thoroughly shaken up and overturned. They essentially presented themselves as, or at least claimed to be, islands of stability within a chaotic and turbulent region. Now they realize that they themselves are under threat. This necessitates that all these countries, including Saudi Arabia, examine and adopt new security arrangements. None of these states trust Iran, but many of these states have also become somewhat less confident with regard to America because they simply consider Donald Trump to be unpredictable. This means that these states will now arm themselves to the teeth. This will benefit the defense industry, but it might not be beneficial for regional stability. So you'd say it stays with the banks there, for now, right? Yes, the situation there will remain unstable, even if the immediate conflict ends now. We have to see what the solution is for this nuclear program. The scenario where Iran ends up retaining some of this highly enriched uranium is likely to prompt other countries to seriously consider, if not actively pursue, the development of their own nuclear weapons. This might be seen as a necessary deterrent, a preventative measure to counterbalance Iran's nuclear capabilities. So all of these scenarios are possible, which is why it is important for the entire international community to remain committed to this region. After all, no one has any interest in us ending up with a Middle East heavily armed with nuclear weapons, which is already the most unstable region in the world. That will probably keep us busy for many years to come.
Let us also take a look at Ukraine. Mr. Neumann, the brutal war in Ukraine continues, unabated. However, we are observing a clear trend of Ukraine increasingly and effectively targeting Putin's oil industry with its attacks. Is this a turning point in the war? Is Ukraine actually succeeding in harming Putin in this way?
Well, firstly, it's true that Putin is profiting from the sudden surge in oil prices. However, simultaneously, and you're absolutely correct in this observation, he's encountering significant challenges in actually exporting this oil and successfully selling it to his existing customer base. And the Ukrainian offensive is also contributing to this. What's particularly interesting is how this war, as a direct result of the Iran war, has acquired a considerably more pronounced economic dimension, a characteristic that was perhaps not so evident beforehand. It's too early for me to say whether this represents a turning point, but it's clear that Ukraine is making progress. At the beginning of this conflict, we thought that Ukraine would be the big loser. But that is not the case at the moment. Consequently, the Ukrainians have developed a situation where a supposed weakness may have turned into a strategic advantage, lich, even sip. That's the crucial point here now. How, if at all, can Ukraine perhaps compel Putin into negotiations, the outcome of which would subsequently have a positive effect on the war's progress? Well, a lot would still have to happen. I think the point at which Putin comes to the negotiating table is the point at which Donald Trump tells him, "You have to do this," and we are still a very, very long way from that point. Donald Trump is angry with the Europeans. He, in fact, also lays the responsibility for the Ukraine war on the Europeans. Right now, he has absolutely no capacity whatsoever to dedicate himself to dealing with this issue. Let's not forget, American foreign policy has, at this point, become the foreign policy of just 4 or 5 individuals within Donald Trump's immediate circle. Yes, Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, Steve Witkoff, Marco Rubio, JDB, along with 1 or 2 others. They are deeply involved in all these conflicts, and are, of course, completely occupied by the ongoing war with Iran and the volatile situation in the Middle East. Well, I believe it will unfortunately take some time before Ukraine once again appears at the top of the priority list. Yes. Thank you very much for these exciting insights. Thank you for this interview, Mr. Neumann. Thank you very much.
Bonjour Vincent Hervouet.
Mais bonjour Jacques.
J-1 Vincent, demain expire le cessez-le-feu dans le Golfe. La délégation américaine dirigée par J.D. Evans avec Steve Witkoff et Jared Kushner est attendue ce matin à Islamabad et va y attendre les Iraniens pour négocier la suite. L'histoire hésite.
Oui, alors objectivement, les protagonistes ont intérêt à une négociation réussie. Les Iraniens au pouvoir, que le blocus étrangle et qui sont menacés d'un chaos. Pour l'instant, ils tiennent la rue. Ils savent ce qu'ils ont à perdre, la vie notamment. A contrario, un compromis leur permettrait de récupérer les milliards confisqués par les Américains. Ils ont encaissé le choc de l'agression, mais maté la population. Leur stratégie a mis en échec le petit et le grand Satan. Ils ont gagné la bataille médiatique. Mais et l'objectif d'une guerre asymétrique comme celle qu'ils mènent actuellement, c'est de gagner du temps, décourager l'ennemi. Et sur ce plan, on peut dire que les gardiens de la Révolution, peuvent pavoiser. Donald Trump, lui, joue sa présidence. Il doit s'extirper du bourbier. Il y a urgence. Son impatience, qui est tellement visible, elle est contre-productive. Mais elle est révélatrice. Le président s'est isolé de ses alliés, de la base de son électorat, MAGA, et même de son gouvernement. Ces tweets menaçants qui alternent avec des rodomontades triomphales, finissent par lasser, et le gallon d'essence coûte désormais plus de $4. Les uns et les autres ont donc besoin d'un compromis. Ils ont les moyens de sauver la face. Et après tout, il n'y a pas de défaite tant qu'on ne l'a pas reconnu.
Sur l'essentiel, Vincent, le nucléaire, il n'y a pas de compromis possible?
Au contraire, les diplomates sont experts à découper les problèmes insolubles en tranches fines et digestes. À la veille de la guerre à Oman, les négociateurs iraniens ne rejetaient pas l'idée de diluer l'uranium, de ramener à 5% son enrichissement, c'est-à-dire suffisant pour une utilisation civile, mais pas pour un usage militaire. Il faudrait évidemment garder un œil vigilant sur les labos iraniens, mais après tout, l'AIEA est faite pour ça. Lorsqu'ils se sont rencontrés à Islamabad il y a 10 jours, J.D. Vance exigeait, primo, que l'Iran renonce par principe et pour toujours à l'arme nucléaire. Ça tombe bien, en théorie, la République islamique prétend l'avoir bannie, et il y a même une fatwa pour ça. En pratique, le diable est dans les détails. 0 bombe, ça voudrait dire limiter la production de missiles, par exemple. Secondo, la remise des 440 kilos d'uranium enrichi à 60% que l'Iran a accumulé au mépris total de ses engagements et que les États-Unis et Israël n'ont pas réussi à détruire avec les bombardements de l'été dernier. Donald Trump a admis cette nuit qu'il serait long et difficile d'exhumer l'uranium des décombres des sites bombardés l'été dernier. Enfin, les Américains voulaient un moratoire de 20 ans sur l'enrichissement. 5 ans, répondaient les Iraniens. Les palabres ont duré 21 heures. avant que J.D. Vance ne claque la porte. Washington veut un accord sur un cadre de négociation. Les Iraniens veulent tout de suite entrer dans les détails techniques. Et il y a 10 jours, eh bien, ce dialogue de sourds a conduit à l'impasse. On n'est pas sûr ce matin qu'on en soit sorti d'ailleurs.
Et pour Benjamin Netanyahou, laisser l'Iran continuer ses recherches en matière nucléaire sera difficile à accepter.
Mais alors, les Israéliens, vous savez, c'est le contraire des Américains. Ils savent pourquoi ils se battent, ils sont derrière leur gouvernement, ils sont prêts à endurer les bombardements, ils sont déterminés à tenir le temps qu'il faudra, et prêts à aller jusqu'au bout, c'est-à-dire éradiquer une fois pour toutes la menace iranienne. Donald Trump n'a pas du tout le même agenda, et c'est le dernier point qu'il faut souligner ce matin. Un mauvais compromis aurait des conséquences désastreuses pour les États-Unis. La confiance qu'ils inspirent est entamée, leurs alliés ont déjà pris de la distance, et leurs rivaux vont en tirer les leçons. Vous savez, si les djihadistes n'avaient pas abandonné Kaboul aux talibans, dans une véritable débat qu'il y a 4 ans, sans doute que Vladimir Poutine n'aurait pas envahi l'Ukraine.
Ainsi va le monde. Signature Europe 1, Vincent Hervouette. Merci Vincent.